like other things I gotta be doing around that time. But yeah, I picked one in Kyrie Baby. Bowser Jr. broken.
In Smash Ultimate, there's been one character who has slowly but surely been rising through the ranks. In tier lists, in usage, and in tournament results. This character, rarely even seen in the past few years, has exploded onto the scene, and in a way that has many people questioning if this character is secretly a top tier, lying in wait. I, of course, am speaking of Bowser Jr. Being introduced in Smash 4, but being considered relatively garbage in that game, Jr. was very under the radar in Smash Ultimate. For the first few years of competition, this character mostly saw isolated success. Success, to be sure, but nothing even remotely consistent. And until the last half year or so, many people considered Jr. to be an obscure mid-tier character, capable of matchup checking top players for upsets every now and again, but nothing more. So what changed? Why are people speaking so highly of Jr. now that some even claim he has no weaknesses? My name's Rister Mice, and today we'll be going over the meteoric rise of Bowser Jr. in competitive Smash Ultimate. Most of this will be from the beginning of the year up until now, because that's when things really started to pick up in quantity. But any discussion of Bowser Jr.'s resurgence in the meta has to begin in one place, or rather with one player, TM7 Zap. So a mid or low tier character becoming seen as actually pretty decent isn't a rare occurrence in Smash Bros. History. I mean, heck, just look at Yoshi in Melee. But with cases like this, it usually follows a similar pattern. No one plays the character, so no one's pushing their meta. Then a single, extremely dedicated person starts to push the character to new heights that no one has ever seen before. This then convinces everyone else that the character is viable, and so the character starts seeing more widespread usage across all levels of competition. We're actually gonna see this trend impact Ultimate Jr. as the video goes on. But for right now, think of TM7 Zap as the AMSA in this case. Yes, Jr. did have other early adopters, like Ketchup, Yoda Cage, and Young Eevee, among others. But at the time of Zap's rise in relevance, most of those competitors had either retired completely or were competing less often, least of all because of lockdowns. TM7 Zap made his name known during the past few years in online tournaments, where he gained a reputation for being a grinder. Most notably, he received quite a bit of attention from Hungrybox at his online tournaments, which led to Zap being featured in many streams, clips, tweets, and videos. A factor that undoubtedly contributed to his rising notoriety. But Zap also gained another reputation, this one being more negative. You see, many people were convinced that Zap was a Wi-Fi only gimmick player, that he'd never see the same success he was seeing online, taking down the likes of Sonics, Spargo, or Shiny Mark, if he were to go to an offline major. And despite some isolated success, like an offline win on Riddles, it seemed as though the trash talk had some merit. Well, that is, until it didn't. TM7 Zap went on an insane run at Cirque du CFL 4, with a final placement of 9th, almost making post-lockdown history with a top 8 major placement. Most of Zap's good wins here came in top 32, beating Aaron, Louis Money, and going game 5 with LG's very own Tweak. And although this run left a bad taste in the mouths of certain competitors, it was Zap's best offline performance to date. He followed this up a few months later at the Coinbox IRL 2, a B+ tier where Zap did manage to make top 8, with wins over Lima, The Beck, and Crepe Soleil, all amazing offline wins. In regards to the pattern we discussed earlier in the video, these two breakout performances by this single, extremely dedicated player is what signaled to the rest of the community that Bowser Jr. could in fact do it. That there was a meta here to push and pursue. Don't get me wrong, Zap's story is far from over, but the next chapter in it simply hasn't been written yet, as Zap has been back to grinding online tournaments in preparation for the next big offline event. So now, the rest of, and the lion's share of this video will be dedicated to the rest of the junior player base emboldened by Zap's success, who have started to rise from the woodwork and make their names known. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these players didn't exist before Zap's 2 strong offline runs, but those performances emboldened and encouraged Bowser Jr. mains to start traveling or competing at majors in their home region. And it certainly encouraged them to push the meta of their character that Zap was pioneering. And this is that widespread usage across all levels of competition that I talked about earlier. And in terms of these breakout stars, we'll be going over them chronologically. Our first story takes us to Luminosity Makes Big Moves 2025, the first major of the new year, where an insanely improbable upset occurred, at least on paper. Grit is a Bowser Jr. player competing in the New England region, same as Light and Ling, among others. Here in New York though, Grit would make it through pools by defeating Marvale 3-1 and clutching up a Game 5 set against Pitaya's Kazuya. Once out of pools though, and into top 128, Grit had to face off against Mars, Luminosity Gaming's very own. Now, on paper, this should have been it. Player matchup aside, Zero Suit Samus is considered one of, if not the worst matchup for Bowser Jr. in general. In fact, as a general consensus, basically the 3 matchups junior players hate facing the most are Zero Suit Samus, Aegis, and Palutena, with that last one being particularly interesting if you remember us discussing Zap upsetting Louis Money earlier on in the video. Either way, for as much as I just talked about how unwinnable this matchup is for Junior, you know who doesn't care about that? Grit, who proceeded to defeat Mars in a close Game 5 that sadly wasn't put on stream. Eventually, Grit would place 33rd out of 832 as the 179th seed at LMBM 2025. But this set is of particular interest to those who claim that Bowser Jr. has no weaknesses. After all, bad matchups, especially into meta-relevant characters like Aegis or Palutena, is something that actually holds quite a few characters back in the tier list. But if Bowser Jr. players can take upsets off of the top rep of one of their worst matchups, well, suddenly that factor doesn't seem so important, now does it? Next, we move over to Genesis X2, where we've actually got 2 stories to look at. The first of which coming from Yoda Cage. Now, I actually do have to give a massive shout out to Yoda Cage here, as he's basically the only early adopter of Junior from the game's early days who is still around, doing stuff. At Smash's Super Bowl down in San Jose, California, Yoda Cage made some big waves. The Philadelphian Morton main entered Genesis X2 on Valentine's Day as the 82nd seed, starting off the weekend by getting through Phase 1 pools and headed into Phase 2. Here, Yoda Cage faced off against Yamadi, a Rosalina and Luma player from Japan, who's considered to be one of the best Japanese, if not worldwide, reps for the character. But even Yamadi would get placed in the Yoda Cage, losing in a Game 5 set for an Upset Factor 2 set win for Yoda Cage. After losing the next set to Shiny Mark, Yoda Cage would defeat Inkling main Colorando 8 to make it into top 64 on loser's side, where he'd then proceed to defeat Yanni 3-1 and go Game 5 versus Jogibu, the Japanese Captain Falcon main who had just upset DeBuzz earlier in bracket. Sadly, this Game 5 would not go in Yoda Cage's favor, and he'd bow out of Genesis X2 at 33rd place. But this isn't where we stop talking about this tournament, because believe it or don't, yet another junior main made massive waves in this very same bracket, and there's a good chance you've already heard about it. It's time we talk about Waara. Waara is yet another Morton Koopa main from NorCal, coincidentally the same region Genesis takes place in, giving Waara the boost of the hometown hero. Entering into the tournament as the 104th seed, much lower than the previous story in this video, Waara started off by making it through Phase 1 pools before moving into Phase 2. And this is where things get truly crazy. Waara started off by taking a 3-1 set over Riddles, Team Liquid's very own, and the 25th seed, which was good for an upset factor of 4. Given how we talked about TM7 Zap also beating riddles earlier on in the video, it seems as if everyone's biggest Terry Bogard fan has somewhat of a demon in the Koopalings. Regardless, Waara then moved on to a set that had proved much closer, versus Gact. Gact, the Japanese NES, was the 40th seed, lower than Riddles, so a win here wouldn't mean as much on paper. But while the Riddles set was a comfortable 3-1, Waara would soon face a Game 5 situation versus Gact. A tense moment, but that's when it happened. Waara defeated Gact in that pivotal Game 5, moving into top 64 through winner's side after making a double upset. And while that angle provided a good view of the gameplay, I want to give you another view of this win from the other side of the table. As many on Twitter pointed out at the time, this moment between Waara and Gact is sort of what competitive Smash Bros is all about in a single moment. The focus, the tension, and then the explosion. Both of passionate celebration from Waara and of heartbreaking loss for Gact. Both players have crowds behind them who wanted them to go further, but only one of those crowds can be appeased. And yet, there's not a single soul in that moment who can claim that wasn't some good Smashy Bros. Waara would move on in bracket, but ultimately be double eliminated. First by Tweak in a 3-0 sweep, and then to Hero, Japan's best Bowser player, in a close Game 5. I guess King Koopa put his kid in timeout, which eliminated Waara at 33rd place as the 104th seed. And so, we're brought to the final story of today's video, moving all the way up to Cavalier Clash 6, North America's most recent major. Here, our hero would be a New Jersey Bowser Jr. main by the name of Mr. Muggs, otherwise known as Mr. Thugs. Coming into Cav Clash 6 as the 103rd seed, Mr. Muggs lost early on in pools to Endothia's Game & Watch, clawing through losers to make top 64 after clutching up a Game 5. At this point, Mr. Muggs would defeat talented Ike main Luxa in a 3-1 set before moving on in bracket to face off against Steve main Haunter GV. Now, Haunter is one of the best players in Central/South America, hailing from the same country as Shiny Mark, Guatemala, and is generally considered to be their second best player. This doesn't even mention the fact that Steve is considered far and away to be the best character in the game by most people. If Bowser Jr. can win against his worst matchups, like we saw with Grit earlier on, what about a character with a significant tier gap? Well, this set was close, going down to a decisive Game 5, but then...
Oh, it's okay, it's okay. Good back air. Let's go! Let's go! Let's go, Benny!
Mr. Muggs defeated Haunter GV in a close Game 5 set, hopping off and moving on in brackets, eliminating Haunter at 33rd place as the 19th seed, a set win that turned out to be an upset factor 5. Sadly, Mr. Muggs would go on to lose to Ling for a final placement of 25th as the 103rd seed. But interestingly enough, Ling had actually defeated Grit, who we mentioned earlier in the video, the round before this, so he was certainly warmed up for the matchup. Grit also had a somewhat notable run at Cav Clash, getting minor upsets over the likes of the Beck, but Mr. Muggs had the biggest upset and highest placement of any junior main at this American major. And that's it for the stories I've got for you today. But if you've been listening along, you may be wondering something at this point. Sure, these are all good wins and good placements. 33rd at Smash's largest tournament series is nothing to scoff at. But these aren't exactly top 8 finishes, so why do we care? Aren't these just isolated upsets like what we mentioned near the top of this video? Yes, you'd be correct in recognizing that the stories in this video are just solitary upsets, with Waara having the closest thing to an actual big run throughout the length of this video. But here's the thing, and the main takeaway here. It's not just one person anymore. When we started this tournament, it was basically just TM7 Zap who was carrying the torch of Junior. But when it was just him getting big upsets, it could have been seen as stagnation. But that's not where we've ended. Zap is now on the verge of top 8ing a major. Many new Bowser Jr. players are getting these massive upsets in bracket, and even the old guard of Junior are coming back in full force to push their characters' once dead meta. As far as North America goes at least, you're gonna start seeing Bowser Jr. players more and more in the later phases of brackets. His bad matchups couldn't keep him down, the best character in the game couldn't keep him down, and established top players couldn't keep him down. Bowser Jr. is a late meta top tier character who may indeed have no weaknesses. And if we keep treating him like he's still the obscure mid tier he once was, it'll be far too late to stop him. But that's gonna be it for today's video. What do you all think? Is Bowser Jr. really Smash Ultimate's secret top tier? Or is all this just recency bias or a coincidence? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. But until then, I've been Mr. Mice, and thank you all so very much for watching.